You won't believe what happened in the Senate today. It was supposed to be just another hearing, a routine clash of ideas, in a room full of lawmakers, policy wonks, and cameras capturing every word. But what unfolded wasn't just a debate. It was a moment that shook the chamber, lit up the internet, and reminded everyone why underestimating Senator John Kennedy is a mistake you only make once. The topic on the table, public education reform, a subject that always sparks fiery opinions. Everyone expected tough questions and sharp exchanges, but no one saw this coming. Senator Adam Schiff, known for his razor-sharp rhetoric, took a swing that turned personal, mocking Kennedy's education with a jab that left the room gasping. But what Kennedy said next, it wasn't just a comeback. It was a masterclass in dignity, wit, and pure Southern brilliance. The audience was stunned, social media exploded, and you're about to find out why this moment is one for the history books. Trust us, you don't want to miss this. The Senate chamber was buzzing as the hearing kicked off. Rows of lawmakers sat at their desks, aides shuffled papers, and the C-SPAN cameras hummed quietly, ready to broadcast every second to the world. The issue at hand, public education reform, was a lightning rod. It's the kind of topic that brings out big ideas, bigger egos, and plenty of posturing. Senators from both sides of the aisle were ready to dig in, armed with stats, studies, and sound bites. The air was thick with anticipation, not just because of the topic, but because of the players involved. Adam Schiff, the California senator, with a reputation for cutting through arguments like a hot knife through butter, was expected to dominate. His style is precise, his words carefully chosen, and his delivery often laced with just enough edge to keep opponents on their toes. Across the room sat John Kennedy, the Louisiana senator, whose slow Southern drawl and folksy charm make him seem more like your neighbor than a political heavyweight. But those who know Kennedy know better than to judge him by his accent. He's a force, and today the chamber was about to learn just how much of one. As the hearing rolled on, the debate grew heated. Senators traded points about funding curriculum and access to quality schools. Schiff took the floor, his voice commanding attention as he laid into the Republican stance on education. He argued with passion, citing data and anecdotes, his words sharp enough to draw nods from his allies and grimaces from his opponents. But then something shifted. Schiff's tone took on a new edge, not just critical, but personal. With a smirk that was impossible to miss, he turned his attention to Kennedy. It's hard to take education advice from someone who sounds like they got their degree from a cereal box. Schiff said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The words landed like a thunderclap. The room went still. A few of Schiff's supporters chuckled, but most of the chamber froze. Senators glanced at each other, some shaking their heads, others leaning forward, sensing the moment had just taken a dangerous turn. Even in the rough and tumble world of politics, this was a low blow. To call out Kennedy by name, to mock his education in front of colleagues' cameras and the American public, it was bold, risky, and maybe a little reckless. All eyes turned to Kennedy. The Louisiana senator sat quietly, his face unreadable. No scowl, no clenched fists, just a calm, almost serene pause. The cameras zoomed in, catching every detail. You could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut. Whispers seemed to ripple through the room. Is he going to respond? What's he going to say? Kennedy adjusted his glasses, leaned toward his microphone, and took a slow, deliberate breath. What came next wasn't just a response. It was a moment that would redefine the debate, and the way people saw John Kennedy. His voice, steady and rich with that unmistakable Southern cadence, filled the chamber. "Sir," he began, "I may talk like I'm from the country, but my degrees weren't handed out with breakfast cereal. I earned them just like I've earned the trust of the people I serve. If you're done with cheap shots, maybe we can focus on giving every American child a real shot at a good education." The words hit like a wave washing over the room with a force that was quiet, but undeniable. No shouting, no insults, just truth, delivered with a clarity that cut deeper than any raised voice could. The chamber was silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Some senators shifted in their seats, trying to hide their reactions. Others nodded slowly, clearly impressed. Even a few of Schiff's usual allies looked down, avoiding eye contact, as if they knew their colleague had miscalculated. Kennedy's response wasn't just a defense of his own credentials, it was a masterstroke that turned the tables. He didn't take the bait and fire back with anger. He didn't stoop to personal attacks. Instead, he used the moment to remind everyone what the hearing was supposed to be about the future of America's children. But Kennedy wasn't done. He looked around the room, his gaze steady, and added, "Smart doesn't always sound fancy. Where you're from or how you talk doesn't measure your worth. Intelligence is earned, not performed. And character is shown, not staged." Boom! The mic might as well have hit the floor. In less than a minute, Kennedy had dismantled Schiff's insult, defended his integrity, and redirected the conversation to the heart of the issue: education. The power of Kennedy's words lay in their simplicity. He didn't need to raise his voice or resort to theatrics. His response was surgical, cutting through the noise with precision and grace. It was the kind of moment that makes you sit up straighter, that makes you feel like you're witnessing something bigger than politics. Kennedy wasn't just defending himself, he was speaking for every person who's ever been underestimated because of how they sound or where they're from. His words resonated with a truth that went beyond the Senate chamber, touching on something universal. The idea that real intelligence doesn't need to shout. It speaks with purpose. And in that moment, Kennedy spoke with a purpose that left the room in awe. The reaction was immediate. Aides in the back of the room exchanged glances, some whispering to each other, others jotting down notes. Senators who'd been neutral or even skeptical of Kennedy seemed to sit a little taller, their expressions showing a newfound respect. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to linger on him, as if the operators knew they'd just captured something extraordinary. Schiff, for his part, stayed quiet, his earlier smirk replaced by a tight-lipped expression. The air had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Kennedy hadn't just won the moment, he'd owned it. He'd taken a cheap shot and turned it into a lesson in leadership. A reminder that true strength doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from lifting the conversation up. It didn't take long for the moment to spill beyond the Senate walls. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating online. Social media platforms lit up like wildfire with users posting and reposting Kennedy's response. Hashtags like #HadKennedyClapback and Senate Showdown started trending, and the comments poured in. "That was the cleanest takedown I've ever seen," one user wrote. Schiff came with a jab, but Kennedy brought a sledgehammer. Another posted, "Never judge a Southern accent. Kennedy just gave a masterclass in how to handle an insult with class." Political commentators jumped in, analyzing every word, every pause, every glance. Even some of Schiff's usual supporters admitted he'd gone too far, underestimating an opponent who was far more formidable than his folksy demeanor suggested. YouTube channels were quick to seize the moment, uploading the footage with dramatic music, slow-motion replays, and bold captions like, "Kennedy destroys Schiff in 60 seconds, and this is how you respond like a boss." Reaction videos flooded the platform with titles like "Kennedy's epic comeback goes viral" and "Schiff just got schooled." In an age where viral moments are often fueled by chaos and shouting matches, This one stood out for its composure. Kennedy didn't need to yell or sling insults. He raised the standard, showing that you can win a fight with dignity and still come out on top. The internet couldn't get enough of it. Memes, mashups, and montages spread like wildfire, each one celebrating Kennedy's calm, confident takedown. What made this moment so remarkable wasn't just the exchange itself, it was what it represented. Kennedy's response wasn't about settling a personal score. It was about standing up for something bigger. When he said, "Smart doesn't always sound fancy," he wasn't just talking about himself. He was speaking for millions of Americans who've been judged unfairly because of their accent, their background, or their way of speaking. He was speaking for the factory worker with a high school diploma, who's smarter than half the room. For the small-town teacher who doesn't talk like she went to Harvard but knows more about her students than any expert. For the kid from a rural town who's been told they'll never make it because they don't sound polished enough. In one sentence, Kennedy flipped the script on every stereotype thrown at working-class Americans, Southern communities, and anyone who's ever been underestimated. This wasn't just a Senate moment, it was a cultural one. It was a reminder that true intelligence doesn't need to be loud or flashy. It's measured in the clarity of your ideas, the strength of your character, and the way you treat others, even when they come at you with a cheap shot. Kennedy didn't just respond to Schiff, he set an example. He showed that you don't have to stoop to someone else's level to win. You don't have to match their venom with venom. You can rise above, stay true to yourself, and still come out stronger. That's what made the room go silent. That's what made the internet explode. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the hearing fades from the headlines. As the hearing continued, the energy in the room was different. Senators who'd been ready to jump back into the debate seemed to tread more carefully, as if Kennedy's words had reset the tone. The focus shifted back to education, to the real issues at stake: funding for schools, opportunities for kids, the future of the country. But even as the discussion moved forward, you could tell the moment was still resonating. Aides kept glancing at Kennedy, reporters scribbled furiously, and the cameras stayed trained on him, waiting for another spark of brilliance. They didn't get one, not because Kennedy didn't have more to say, but because he didn't need to. He'd said everything that mattered in under a minute, and he'd done it with a poise that left everyone else scrambling to keep up. The story of that day in the Senate isn't just about a clever comeback or a viral clip. It's about what happens when you underestimate someone who's spent their life proving doubters wrong. John Kennedy didn't just defend his education, he defended the idea that intelligence comes in many forms, that character matters more than credentials, and that leadership means lifting others up, not tearing them down. For those watching at home, it was more than a political win. It was a moment that felt personal, a moment that spoke to anyone who's ever been looked down on and come out stronger. If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you talk or where you're from? Let's keep this conversation going, because in the end, intelligence doesn't shout. It speaks with purpose, and John Kennedy spoke louder than anyone in that room. You won't believe what happened after Senator John Kennedy's unforgettable response in the Senate. The room was still reeling from his calm, razor-sharp comeback to Adam Schiff's biting insult, a moment that turned a routine hearing into a viral sensation. But to understand why Kennedy's words hit so hard, you need to know the man behind the microphone. This wasn't just a clever quip from a seasoned politician, it was a glimpse into the character of a senator who's made a career out of defying expectations. With his slow Southern drawl and homespun charm, Kennedy might sound like he's stepped off a Louisiana porch. but his response to Schiff proved he's a force to be reckoned with. The internet was buzzing. The chamber was stunned, and the moment was far from over. What makes John Kennedy so remarkable isn't just what he said. It's who he is and how he's built a legacy of connecting with people, outsmarting opponents, and staying true to his roots. Buckle up because you're about to see why this man is anything but ordinary. The Senate chamber was still tingling with the aftershock of Kennedy's response. Adam Schiff's jab mocking Kennedy's education as something pulled from a cereal box had backfired spectacularly. The room, moments ago, a battlefield of ideas about public education reform, had transformed into a stage for something bigger, a clash of character, wit, and conviction. Senators sat at their desks, some scribbling notes, others whispering to aides, all trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The C-SPAN cameras, ever present, captured every angle, zooming in on Kennedy as he sat back, his face calm, but his eyes sharp, like a chess player who'd just made a winning move. Schiff, meanwhile, seemed to shrink slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by a tight-lipped pause. The air was electric, not just because of the exchange, but because everyone knew they'd seen something rare, a moment when one person's words didn't just win an argument, but redefined the entire conversation. John Kennedy is no stranger to being underestimated. His Southern accent, peppered with folksy sayings, often leads opponents to assume he's less formidable than he is. But that's where they go wrong. Kennedy's charm isn't a mask, it's a bridge. He speaks the language of everyday people, not to hide his intelligence, but to make it accessible. In a world of polished sound bites and rehearsed speeches, Kennedy's authenticity stands out like a beacon. His ability to distill complex ideas into plain, powerful truths has earned him a loyal following, not just in Louisiana, but across the country. He's the senator who can break down a policy debate with a quip like, "You can't fix stupid, but you can vote it out," and still hold his own in the most cerebral corners of Washington. That's what made Schiff's insult so misguided. It wasn't just an attack on Kennedy's credentials, it was a misjudgment of the man himself. In the moments after his response, Kennedy didn't gloat or linger on the victory. He leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and let the hearing move forward. That restraint, that refusal to bask in the spotlight is part of what makes him so compelling. He didn't need to hammer the point home, his words had already done the work. The other senators, sensing the shift, adjusted their tone. The debate returned to education reform, but it was different now, more focused, as if Kennedy's clarity had reminded everyone why they were there. Even Schiff, usually quick to fire back, stayed quiet for a beat, perhaps realizing he'd underestimated his opponent. The cameras caught it all, the glances, the nods, the subtle recalibrations of a room that had just been schooled in the art of leadership. What sets Kennedy apart isn't just his quick wit or his ability to turn an insult into a teaching moment. It's his ability to connect. He speaks for people who feel overlooked, who know what it's like to be judged by how they sound or where they're from. When he said smart doesn't always sound fancy, he wasn't just defending himself. He was giving voice to millions of Americans who have been dismissed because they don't fit the mold of a big city elite. The factory worker who solves problems faster than the guy in the suit. The small-town teacher who knows her students' struggles better than any bureaucrat. The kid from a rural community who's been told they'll never make it because they don't talk like a news anchor. Kennedy's words resonated because they weren't just about him, they were about them. And in that Senate chamber, he became their champion. The internet predictably went wild. Within minutes, clips of Kennedy's response were racing across social media. Twitter was ablaze with hashtags like #KennedyClapback and #Senate Showdown, as users shared and reshared the footage. This is how you handle a bully. One post read, racking up thousands of likes. Schiff thought he was clever, but Kennedy buried him with class. Another said, commentators from political analysts to everyday viewers couldn't stop talking about it. Kennedy didn't just win the moment he redefined it, one pundit wrote. He showed that you don't need to shout to be heard. Even some of Schiff's usual supporters admitted he'd crossed a line. That was a cheap shot, one liberal commentator tweeted. Kennedy's response was a masterclass in staying above the fray. The moment was everywhere amplified by the speed of the digital age, where a single soundbite can become a cultural touchstone in hours. YouTube was ground zero for the frenzy. Channels uploaded the clip with dramatic flair, slow-motion replays, bold captions, and music that made it feel like a movie trailer. Kennedy humiliates Schiff. In 60 seconds, one video declared, "This is how you respond like a pro." Another proclaimed. Reaction videos poured in with creators breaking down every word, every pause, every glance. "Look at Schiff's face," one YouTuber pointed out, freeze-framing the moment. "He knows he messed up." Another said Kennedy didn't just defend himself, he spoke for everyone who's ever been underestimated. The comments sections were a flood of admiration, with viewers sharing their own stories of being judged for their accents or backgrounds. "I'm from the South, and I've been told I sound dumb my whole life," one commenter wrote. Kennedy just made me feel seen. In a world where viral moments often thrive on chaos, this one was different. It was about composure, conviction, and a quiet kind of strength. Kennedy's response wasn't just a personal victory, it was a cultural moment. It tapped into something deeper, a frustration with the condescension that often drips from political elites. When Schiff mocked Kennedy's education, he wasn't just attacking one senator, he was echoing a mindset that dismisses entire communities as less than. Kennedy's comeback flipped that narrative on its head. He didn't just defend his own intelligence, he challenged the idea that intelligence has to look or sound a certain way. His words were a reminder that real smarts show up in how you think, how you act, and how you treat others, not in how polished your accent is or how many big words you can string together. That's why the moment hit so hard. It wasn't just about a senator from Louisiana, it was about every person who's ever felt looked down on and kept going anyway. Back in the Senate chamber, the hearing continued, but the energy had shifted. Senators who'd been ready to spar seemed to choose their words more carefully, as if Kennedy's response had set a new standard. Aides in the background whispered to each other, some smiling, others nodding as they processed what they'd seen. The C-SPAN cameras kept rolling, but it was clear the real story of the day was already written. Kennedy didn't need to say another word. His point was made. Schiff, for his part, tried to pivot back to the policy discussion, but his earlier bravado was gone. The room had witnessed a masterclass, not just in debate, but in character. Kennedy had taken a cheap shot and turned it into a moment that would echo far beyond the Capitol. The ripple effects were immediate. Political blogs lit up with analysis praising Kennedy's poise and questioning Schiff's judgment. This was a miscalculation, one outlet wrote. Schiff thought he could score points, but Kennedy turned it into a lesson. On social media, the memes were relentless images of Kennedy with captions like "Southern charm, surgical precision," and "Don't mess with Louisiana." But beyond the humor, there was a deeper conversation brewing. People were talking about what it means to be underestimated, about the assumptions we make based on how someone sounds or where they're from. Kennedy's response had sparked something bigger than a Senate spat. It had ignited a discussion about respect, dignity, and the power of staying true to yourself. What makes John Kennedy so effective isn't just his quick thinking or his ability to deliver a line that sticks. It's his authenticity. He doesn't talk like a politician trying to impress. He talks like a person who knows who he is and what he stands for. That's why his response to Schiff didn't just win the day it won hearts. It reminded people that leadership isn't about tearing others down or proving you're the loudest voice in the room. It's about standing up for what's right, speaking with purpose, and lifting others up along the way. Kennedy's words weren't just a defense of his own character, they were a call to rethink how we measure intelligence and worth. As the hearing wound down, the focus returned to education reform, but the shadow of Kennedy's moment loomed large. Senators debated funding and curriculum, but you could tell their minds were still on what had just happened. The aides, the reporters, the viewers at home, they were all still processing. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat quietly, his work done. He didn't need to say more. He'd already said everything that mattered, and he'd done it in a way that left no room for doubt. This was a man who knew how to fight, without losing himself, how to win, without stooping low. And in doing so, he'd given the country something to talk about, something to rally behind, something to remember. If this moment struck a chord with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been judged for how you talk or where you're from? What did you do to prove them wrong? Let's keep this conversation alive, because John Kennedy didn't just respond to an insult. He started a movement. Intelligence doesn't need to shout. It speaks with purpose. And today, Kennedy's voice was louder than ever. You won't believe what happened after Senator John Kennedy's unforgettable takedown in the Senate. His calm surgical response to Adam Schiff's biting insult didn't just silence the room, it set the internet ablaze and sparked a conversation that reached far beyond the Capitol. What was supposed to be a routine hearing on public education reform had turned into a defining moment, one that showcased Kennedy's wit, dignity, and unshakable character. The chamber was still buzzing, the cameras were still rolling, and the world was watching as Kennedy's words echoed across social media news outlets and dinner table conversations. This wasn't just a clever comeback. It was a cultural touchstone that reminded everyone why underestimating John Kennedy is a mistake you don't make twice. The internet exploded, the headlines roared, and you're about to see how one senator's response became a movement. Trust us, this is a story you'll want to hear. The Senate chamber was still electric in the wake of Kennedy's response. Adam Schiff's jab mocking Kennedy's education as something pulled from a cereal box had been met with a comeback so sharp, so poised, that it left the room in stunned silence. Senators sat at their desks, some exchanging glances, others jotting down notes, all grappling with the weight of what they'd just witnessed. The C-SPAN cameras captured every detail, zooming in on Kennedy as he leaned back, his face calm, but his presence commanding. Schiff, meanwhile, seemed to shrink, his earlier smirk replaced by a tight-lipped pause. The air was thick with tension, not just because of the exchange, but because everyone knew they'd seen something extraordinary, a moment when one man's words didn't just win an argument, but shifted the entire narrative. The hearing was supposed to be about education reform, but Kennedy had made it about something bigger: respect, character, and the power of standing up without stooping low. As the debate resumed, the energy in the room had changed. Senators who'd been ready to fire off their own arguments spoke more carefully, as if Kennedy's response had set a new standard. The focus returned to funding curriculum and opportunities for America's students. But the shadow of Kennedy's moment loomed large. Aides whispered in the background, some smiling, others nodding, as they processed what had happened. Even Schiff, usually quick with a retort, seemed to tread lightly, his earlier bravado tempered. The cameras lingered on Kennedy as if expecting another spark of brilliance. But Kennedy didn't need to say more, his words had already done the work. In less than a minute, he'd turned a personal attack into a lesson in leadership, reminding everyone that true strength lies in clarity and conviction, not in cheap shots. The real explosion, though, was happening outside the chamber. Within minutes, clips of Kennedy's response were racing across the internet. Social media platforms lit up like a wildfire, with users sharing and resharing the footage. Twitter was flooded with hashtags like #KennedyClapback and #Senate as people weighed in with awe and admiration. That was the cleanest takedown I've ever seen, one user posted, racking up thousands of likes. Schiff threw a punch, but Kennedy dropped a truth bomb. Another wrote. Political commentators jumped into the fray, dissecting every word, every pause, every glance. Kennedy didn't just defend himself, he redefined the conversation, one analyst wrote. He showed you don't need to shout to be heard. Even some of Schiff's usual allies admitted he'd miscalculated. That was a low blow, one tweeted. Kennedy's response was pure class. The moment was everywhere, fueled by the speed of the digital age, where a single soundbite can become a global phenomenon in hours. YouTube became the epicenter of the frenzy. Channels uploaded the clip with dramatic flair, slow-motion replays, bold captions, and music that made it feel like a Hollywood showdown. Kennedy humiliates Schiff in 60 seconds. One video declared, "This is how you respond like a boss," another proclaimed. Reaction videos poured in with creators breaking down the exchange like sports analysts after a championship game. "Look at Schiff's face," one YouTuber said, freeze framing the moment. "He knows he messed up." Another pointed out, Kennedy didn't just shut him down, he spoke for everyone who's ever been underestimated. The comments sections were a flood of stories from viewers who'd been judged for their accents, their backgrounds, or their roots. "I'm from a small town, and I've been told I sound uneducated my whole life," one commenter wrote. Kennedy just gave me hope. In a world where viral moments often thrive on chaos, this one stood out for its composure, its clarity, its strength. The moment's impact went beyond likes and retweets. It sparked a broader conversation about what it means to be underestimated. When Kennedy said smart doesn't always sound fancy, he wasn't just defending himself, he was challenging a mindset that dismisses people based on how they talk or where they're from. His words resonated with millions who've felt the sting of condescension. Whether it's the worker who's smarter than the room but doesn't sound like it, or the student who's been told they'll never make it because they don't fit the mold. Kennedy's response wasn't just a personal victory, it was a rallying cry for anyone who's ever been overlooked. Political blogs picked up the story, praising Kennedy's poise and questioning Schiff's judgment. "This was a misstep," one outlet wrote. Schiff thought he could score points, but Kennedy turned it into a masterclass. Memes flooded social media images of Kennedy with captions like "Southern charm, surgical precision," and "Don't mess with Louisiana." But beneath the humor was a deeper message. Intelligence isn't about how you sound, it's about what you stand for. Kennedy's response tapped into something universal. It spoke to the frustration of being judged unfairly, of being dismissed because you don't fit the stereotype of smart. He didn't just defend his own character, he defended the character of everyday people. The factory worker who outthinks the executive. The rural teacher who knows her students better than any expert. The kid from a small town who's been told they don't belong in the big leagues. Kennedy's words gave them a voice, a moment to feel seen. And that's why the internet couldn't get enough of it. It wasn't just about a senator owning an opponent. It was about a senator standing up for the underdog, for the people who've been underestimated their whole lives. His message was clear. Your worth isn't measured by your accent or your address. It's measured by your actions, your ideas, and your heart. Back in the Senate, the hearing marched on, but the moment lingered. Senators debated policy, but you could tell their minds were still on Kennedy's words. Aides kept glancing at him, reporters scribbled furiously, and the cameras stayed trained on him, waiting for another spark. But Kennedy didn't need to say more. He'd already made his point, and he'd done it with a quiet confidence that left everyone else scrambling to keep up. Schiff, for his part, tried to steer the conversation back to education, but his earlier edge was gone. The room had witnessed something bigger than a policy debate. It had witnessed a lesson in how to handle adversity with grace. Kennedy hadn't just won the moment he'd set a new standard for what leadership looks like. The online buzz only grew louder. News outlets ran headlines like Kennedy's epic response shuts down Schiff and Southern Senator delivers viral clapback. Commentators across the spectrum weighed in, with some calling it a turning point in how we talk about intelligence and respect in politics. Kennedy didn't just respond to an insult. He started a conversation, one analyst wrote. He reminded us that character matters more than credentials. The memes kept coming, but so did the stories, people sharing how Kennedy's words had inspired them to stand up for themselves, to push back against judgment, to prove their worth. It was more than a viral moment. It was a movement, one that reminded people that true strength doesn't need to shout. It speaks with purpose, and Kennedy's purpose was clear: to lift up the conversation, to defend the overlooked, and to show that dignity always wins. If this moment moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you talk or where you're from? What did you do to prove them wrong? Let's keep this conversation going, because John Kennedy didn't just respond to an insult. He sparked a fire. Intelligence doesn't need to be loud. It speaks with conviction. And today, Kennedy's voice was the loudest in the room. You won't believe how Senator John Kennedy's unforgettable response in the Senate turned a single moment into a movement. His calm, razor-sharp comeback to Adam Schiff's biting insult didn't just silence the chamber, it set the internet on fire and sparked a conversation that reached far beyond Washington. What started as a routine hearing on public education reform became a masterclass in dignity, wit, and Southern brilliance, with Kennedy at its heart. The room was stunned, social media exploded, and the impact of his words kept growing. This wasn't just a viral clip. It was a powerful reminder that true intelligence doesn't need to shout. Kennedy spoke for millions, and his message is still resonating, challenging how we view leadership and worth. Buckle up, because you're about to see why this moment will echo for years. The Senate chamber was still buzzing after Kennedy's response. Schiff's jab, mocking Kennedy's education as something from a cereal box, had been met with a comeback so poised, so piercing, that it left everyone speechless. Senators exchanged glances, aides scribbled notes, and the C-SPAN cameras lingered on Kennedy, his calm presence commanding the room. Schiff, meanwhile, seemed to falter, his earlier smirk gone. The air was electric, not just from the exchange, but because everyone knew they'd witnessed something rare, a moment when one man's words didn't just win a debate, but lifted it to a new level. The hearing was about education reform, but Kennedy had made it about respect, integrity, and standing tall without tearing others down. As the hearing continued, the tone had shifted. Senators spoke more carefully, as if Kennedy's words had set a new standard. The discussion returned to policy, but his moment lingered. Aides whispered, some nodding in admiration, while Schiff, usually quick with a retort, stayed quiet, his bravado softened. Kennedy didn't need to say more. His point was made. In under a minute, he'd turned a personal attack into a lesson in leadership, showing that strength lies in conviction, not cheap shots. The real impact unfolded online. Clips of Kennedy's response flooded social media with hashtags like Kennedy Clapback and #Senate Showdown trending fast. That was the cleanest takedown I've seen one user posted. Schiff tried to play dirty, but Kennedy brought the truth, another wrote. Commentators praised his poise with some of Schiff's allies, admitting he'd miscalculated. That was a low blow, one tweeted. Kennedy's response was pure class. YouTube channels amplified the moment with dramatic edits captions like, "Kennedy shuts down," "Schiff," and reaction videos dissecting every word. He didn't just defend himself. He spoke for everyone who's been underestimated, one creator said. Comments poured in from viewers sharing stories of being judged for their accents or roots. "I'm from a small town, and I've been told I sound dumb," one wrote. "Kennedy made me feel seen." Kennedy's words, "Smart doesn't always sound fancy," struck a chord. They weren't just about him. They were about every worker, teacher, or student who's been dismissed for how they talk or where they're from. He challenged the idea that intelligence has to fit a mold, giving voice to millions who've felt overlooked. Blogs praised his poise with headlines like "Kennedy's epic clapback redefines leadership." Memes of Kennedy with captions like "Southern charm, surgical precision" spread like wildfire. But beyond the humor, a deeper conversation emerged about respect and dignity. The moment was more than a viral hit. It was a call to rethink how we measure worth. Kennedy showed that leadership isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting up the conversation. His response resonated because it spoke to anyone who's been underestimated and kept going. Back in the Senate, the hearing moved on, but Kennedy's words lingered, a reminder that true strength speaks with purpose. If this moment moved you, share it and drop a comment. Have you ever been judged for how you talk or where you're from? Let's keep this conversation going. Because Kennedy didn't just win a debate. He showed us that intelligence speaks with conviction, and his voice will echo for years.